So hello and welcome to another episode of Analog Insights. In today's episode, my friend Greg and I will review the legendary Contax G series. So both the Contax G1 and the Contax G2 featured in one video. Arguably, this is the world's most advanced 35mm rangefinder interchangeable lens camera system. And when it was first introduced in the 1990s, it was considered a true breakthrough and a major challenge to the established mechanical rangefinder manufacturers such as Leica and Voigtlander. And the reason for that is that it came with all sorts of advanced features, such as a rather fast autofocus system, an automatic film advance and rewind, through the lens light and flash metering, and last but not least, beautiful design in a mostly titanium finish. And not only that, the lenses that came with this camera system, or were part of the camera system, are outstanding as well and are famous for the razor sharp images they produce and the great color saturation. We took these cameras out on a photo walk because Greg is the first owner of these cameras, so he purchased both the G1 and the G2 in the 1990s when they were first introduced, and we took them out on two different photo walks around Würzburg, one during a beautiful morning, so we had really nice early morning fog and a great atmosphere to take some photographs, both color and black and white, and then we did another photo walk a little bit later on a heavily overcast day, and where it also eventually started to rain on us, and we had to cut the photo walk a bit short. So without further ado, let's take a closer look at the images that we've taken and the two beautiful cameras. So now let's talk about the features and qualities of the Contax G system, and first focus on the similarities of the Contax G1 and the Contax G2. First and foremost, they come with a beautiful design, and the most popular one is the so-called titanium finish, and that's also the one that was produced much more often, so the black version is a bit rare. It was first introduced, the black version, with the Contax G2 and a set that it came with, so the Contax G2 together with a 28mm, a 45mm and a 90mm lens and a fitting black TTL flash. And the design is really popular until today among celebrities and even fashion bloggers, so I've noticed some images on Instagram where classic fashion bloggers carried this camera kind of as a beautiful accessory, and of course to indicate that they're shooting 35mm film, but also that they're doing that with style. Both cameras come with automatically zooming viewfinders, so once you attach a lens to it, it automatically zooms to the right framing, and a parallax compensation. So especially if you're using the camera for close distance shooting and need to focus on a closer distance, it automatically adjusts the frame correctly for the parallax that you have. And that I found very, very interesting, because as a user of a more mechanical Leica M rangefinder camera, I'm kind of used to doing that mentally, to kind of adjusting my frame and thinking of how the close distance affects the final frame of the image. And here this is a really surprising experience if you just pick up a Contax, do a close-up shot, and then see once you focused, automatically the frame being adjusted. Both cameras also come with automatic exposure lock functions, so you can simply lock your exposure that you've just metered and then take the same exposure settings for several shots in a row. If you want to, you can also, both cameras feature through the lens light and flash metering, which works really, really nice and accurate. So it's no problem at all to use it to expose, for instance, slide film correctly. This is really nice in the automatic mode as well. Both cameras come with an autofocus system, and this is of course really special here. And what I found interesting is that the autofocus system is not run by a motor inside the lenses, but inside the camera. So you do have a motor inside the camera that is coupled with the lenses through a so-called screwdriver coupling system. So whenever you do autofocus, you hear a rather loud sound, and that is then that motor kind of movement is transitioned into the lens, and then it focuses correctly. It does not focus correctly all the time, and that's why I found myself using a feature that both cameras also come with, which is the focusing distance that is displayed inside the viewfinder. So I've repeatedly found myself double checking on the autofocus here and looking at that indication to ensure that it would actually focus correctly and not on something that is more an object that is further in the distance than I intended it to be. Both cameras are run by two small CR2 batteries, and last but not least, they read the film's DX code, the DX information. So how you would usually use the cameras is just taking out a roll of film, popping it in there, having it advanced to the first frame automatically, so wind it in kind of, and then the ISO setting would already be there and you're good to go. But of course you can also manually set the ISO if you want to rate your film differently. So what about the differences between the two cameras? The Contax G1 was sold between 1994 and 1996 and shoots up to 2 frames per second. It is important to note that unmodified, the camera does not take the newer 35mm and 21mm lenses, and there are modified versions out there that make that possible, and ours here is modified, and you basically should look out for or watch out for a green sticker inside the hole for the film canister. Once you see that, you know it's compatible to the newer lenses as well. The camera unfortunately comes with a rather sloppy autofocus system that is dependent on just a passive autofocusing system, and that uses an autofocus illuminator for darker situations, which is so la-la. It's okay, but not really perfect. The shutter speeds range from 16 seconds up to 1/2000th of a second in the automatic mode, and from 1 second up to the same 1/2000th of a second in the manual mode. Unfortunately, the maximum flash sync speed is 1/100th of a second, so not really great, and for some reason the Contax G1 is slightly smaller than the Contax G2. The Contax G2 was sold between 1996 and all the way up to 2005. So overall, if we look at the life cycle of the Contax G series, we see it was sold for 11 years, the 2 different cameras, so quite a long time. And when the Contax G2 was released in 1996, it was considered a significant improvement over the G1, particularly with respect to autofocus and the maximum shutter speed. So with respect to the autofocus, we see an additional active autofocusing system. So the way it would work is it would use the active system first, and then the passive system to fine-tune the focusing distance. And for darker situations, it uses a near infrared light beams to make focusing easier for these darker situations. The maximum shutter speed is an impressive 1/6000th of a second in the automatic mode, and a still really nice 1/4000th of a second in the manual mode. And the flash sync is also a bit increased to 1/200th of a second. It's also important to mention that there is visually one major difference, and that is this big silver control button on the front of the camera that is used for manual focusing, and that is a reference to the classic Contax rangefinders that were sold much earlier. And one final remark, only the Contax G2 takes the 35 to 70 millimeter zoom lens that is available for this camera system. So if you're into zoom lenses, you should go for the Contax G2. All lenses of the Contax G series are made by Kyocera but licensed under Carl Zeiss and are of exceptional quality. When the camera system was first introduced, it came with three different prime lenses: the 28mm f2.8 Biogon, the 45mm f2 Planar, and the 90mm f2.8 Sonnar lens. Later on, there were three additional prime lenses added, namely the 21mm f2.8 Biogon, an incredibly wide 16mm f8 Hologon, which was the only one that was manufactured by Carl Zeiss in Oberkochen in Germany, and a 35mm f2 Planar. And last but not least, as briefly mentioned, there was also a zoom lens, the 35mm to 70, the 35 to 70mm f3.5 to 5.6 Vario Sonnar. So if you're into zoom lenses, you should take a look at this as well. All lenses, as mentioned, are of exceptional quality, really offer razor sharp images and a really nice color saturation. But the lens that really stands out is the 45mm f2 Planar. That is until today considered one of the sharpest 35mm lenses out there. And in a contemporary test, and I found that interesting, these lenses were kind of reviewed and tested against the competition, also the Leica competition, and there was no disadvantage seen in these Kyocera Carl Zeiss lenses. And the results basically speak for themselves, incredibly sharp and really nice, beautiful images that you get out of this lens system. So what about the handling, and what are our personal impressions of the Contax G series? Most importantly, these cameras are a lot of fun to use. So you have a very nice and easy, simple shooting experience. So easy that you sometimes end up eating through a roll of film rather quickly because of the automatic winder and the autofocus system that just make it very easy. And there's also one additional point to that. I sometimes ended up taking another shot just because I wanted to ensure that I would nail focus, because I didn't completely trust the autofocus system. And that is a little downside here. The autofocus is sometimes a bit slow, and especially for closer distances, for close range shooting, it always felt like I had to double check it using the indication inside the viewfinder, the focusing distance, to really ensure that it focuses on the subject that I want it to be in focus and that I will nail focus. So some of the additional shots I took were just, I didn't feel like the autofocus hit what I wanted to hit, and I took an additional shot because it was so easy doing that. Holding the G2 vertically, I found myself often blocking the viewfinder and or the autofocus window, so that didn't feel really intuitive, and I had to adjust my grip to some extent. So a small downside on my side here. It took some getting used to it, but you do eventually. The frame counter even shows when film is loaded when it is switched off, which I found very, very nice. So despite the fact that it is such an advanced camera, this here still works like in a mechanical camera. And what is a bit unfortunate is that all the LCDs here are not illuminated in the dark. So if you would take this camera for a concert, for instance, and shoot there, you would have to get lucky to see the frame counter and other indications that are used with the LCD display. Overall, one can say it's a very nice and modern rangefinder shooting experience. So if you're into that, go for it. If you are a purist and prefer mechanical rangefinder cameras, this camera is certainly not for you. And the only major downside that we could see for this camera system is that when Kyocera shut down the production of the Contax G series in 2005, they also ended the service and repair service for these cameras. So that means it's really, really hard to get these cameras serviced and repaired today and to find appropriate spare parts. So this is the major downside, and we have to mention it here. So thank you very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and this review of the Contax G series. As mentioned, it is a wonderful camera. It comes with incredibly sharp lenses, beautiful design, nice overall handling, but a rather sloppy autofocus experience. And the major downside is that these cameras are not being serviced officially anymore, and it's really hard to get them repaired and to find spare parts. So we hope that you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. If you did, please remember to like this video and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate it. So thanks for watching. Bye.